there. Welcome to Skeleton Key Productions. I'm Current Grade Cocon. Let's get into the video. Today's video we're going to be continuing with our film reviews playlist in which we're looking at different classic Disney films. And today's video we're going to be looking at none other than Peter Pan from 1953. So if you like what you're seeing already, don't forget obviously hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already. I know that 3/4 of you haven't yet subscribed. And obviously hit the bell button so that you stay notified for all of our upcoming videos. So before we dive into the rest of the video, we have to lay out how we do our film reviews videos. So we have 6 different sections. We have section 1, the story of the story, section 2, the story of the creator, section 3, which is the story of the studio, section 4, which are the themes and history, section 5, which is the legacy, and section 6, which is any notable lines or notable effects within the film. So without further ado, we're going to dive into the story of the story, so buckle up and let's go for the ride. So first of all, we'll talk about the story of the story. So the story originally comes from J.M. Barrie, who was a Scotsman writing around the turn of the last century. So the first appearance of Peter Pan was in an adult book written by Barrie in 1902, and this was called The Little White Birds. And in 1904, there was also a West End play, which was called Peter Pan, or The Boy Who Wouldn't Grow Up. And there was also another name for it, which was Peter and Wendy, and I don't know why they had 2 different titles for it, but either way. So you had that in 1904, and in 1911 you had the book which was written. So the film Peter Pan doesn't really stick too much to either of these, so without further ado we're going to dive into the plot of the 1953 film. So the film starts in London around the turn of the last century. So you have Mr. and Mrs. Darling, so this is George and Mary, and they're getting ready for a party. However, they end up being disturbed by John and Michael, who are their 2 sons, and they're fighting, because they're acting out a story about Peter Pan. So Peter Pan is this kind of mythical character, the boy that never grew up, and these stories are coming from their older daughter, Wendy. So Wendy is 11 years old, and George ends up getting quite annoyed at her, because he's like, you need to grow up. And so he says that from now on, she's not going to sleep in the nursery anymore with the boys. It's high time that she grew up, and it's high time that she stopped telling the boys these stories. So before the parents go off to the party, Mary tucks the children in bed, and this is where Wendy sees Peter's shadow. So she keeps Peter's shadow in a drawer in the hope that at some point he ends up coming back for the shadow. And as the parents are leaving off for this party, this is where Peter Pan sneaks into the house with Tinkerbell. So Tinkerbell is this little fairy that kind of goes about from everywhere. But anyway, so he goes in, tries to rescue the shadow, but the shadow obviously has a mind of its own. And so he ends up wrestling with this, and this is when Wendy ends up waking up. So Wendy talks a lot, we'll talk about that a bit later, but she ends up sewing his shadow back on for him. And Peter Pan says, right, you're the one who tells all these stories. I'm going to take you back to the Lost Boys in Neverland, and you're going to be able to tell the stories to them. So you're going to be their new mother. And Wendy ends up being really thrilled with this, but she says that she's so thrilled that she wants to give Peter a kiss. And this makes Tinkerbell very jealous. Some weird reason, I don't know why the fairy would have a crush on this boy, but anyway. So Tinkerbell ends up lashing out at her, ends up attacking her, and in doing so, this ends up waking up George and Michael. So the boys wake up, and the Darling children are all like, yes, we really want to go to Neverland. However, the problem is that none of them can fly. And so after a lot of kind of trial and error is a thing where what Peter Pan remembers is that they need a bit of help of pixie dust. So with a bit of pixie dust and with some happy thoughts, they're able to fly, and they fly all the way to Neverland. So at this point, the film cuts to the pirates, right? And on a pirate ship in Neverland. And this is where we are introduced to Captain Hook. So Captain Hook, in my opinion, is the best Disney villain. We'll talk about him a little bit later as to why he's my favourite. But it's a thing where he appears and he basically is plotting to capture Tiger Lily. So she is the princess of the Indian tribe that are there. We'll talk about them a bit later and why I'm saying Indian, but we'll talk about that a bit later, so just hold your horses, people. But anyway, so he plans to kidnap her in the hope that they will reveal to him where the Lost Boys are hidden and where obviously Peter Pan is hidden. So Captain Hook has the name Hook as a result of Peter Pan in a previous fight cutting off his left hand and throwing it to a crocodile, and that's why he has a hook for a hand. However, the crocodile, ever since then, has had a taste for Captain Hook and comes after him. But Captain Hook is saved each time because the crocodile, for some reason, swallowed an alarm clock, right? And so he's notified by the presence of the crocodile by the noise of this ticking clock. So after he kind of settles down and after like the kind of crocodile like goes away, this is where off in the distance they spot Peter Pan and the Darling children up in the clouds. So this is where Captain Hook orders for the cannons to be shot, and obviously Peter Pan is way too smart for this, so he ends up dodging like all the cannons. But he tells Tinkerbell to take the Darling children to the place where the Lost Boys are hidden. But Tinkerbell flies on ahead and tells the Lost Boys that there is a Wendy bird that Peter Pan has ordered them to shoot down. So when Wendy ends up flying by, this is when the Lost Boys shoot her down. And as she's just about to fall, Peter Pan saves her. So Peter Pan is very annoyed because the boys say that Tinkerbell told them to shoot her down. So Peter Pan, in retaliation for this, ends up punishing Tinkerbell by banishing her forever. Well, she doesn't overhear that he later on says, oh, just for a week. But anyway, so she ends up being banished and she flies off. So at this point, this is where Michael and John end up going off, and John ends up leading the Lost Boys in the hunt for some Indians. We'll talk about that a bit later. But anyway, so he goes off and like the rest of the boys go off. And in the meantime, it's a thing where Peter and Wendy end up going on a tour of the island. So John and Michael and the Lost Boys end up being captured by the Indians, and this is where they're taken to the chief. And the chief says that if you don't give us back Tiger Lily, we're going to burn you at the stake, because for some reason they think that the boys have taken Tiger Lily, because the Indians and the Lost Boys tend to fight each other, yeah, and they think that this is they're doing, right? So Peter and Wendy on this tour, and yet again there's more jealous females in this, we'll talk about that a bit later, but there's some mermaids, and again for some reason the mermaids are infatuated with Peter Pan, so they try and drown Wendy, right? But once this kind of debacle is kind of over, in the distance they see Captain Hook and Smee taking Tiger Lily off to Skull Rock. So Peter and Wendy fly over to Skull Rock, and this is where basically Peter ends up trolling Smee, ends up pretending that he's Captain Hook, and eventually there ends up being a bit of fighting and stuff, yeah, but eventually they end up rescuing Tiger Lily. So now that they're back at the Indian camp, the chief ends up awarding Peter Pan the title of Flying Eagle, right? So now Peter Pan is also a chief as well. And there ends up being this really, really racist song, which we'll talk about a bit later, called What Makes the Red Man Red. So while this is all going on, Tinkerbell is off in the distance and she ends up being kidnapped by Smee. And this is because Smee tells Captain Hook that basically all this kind of jealousy between Tinkerbell and Wendy. So upon her being captured, Captain Hook says, look, I'm not trying to get at Peter Pan. I just want to help you out, right, by getting rid of this Wendy girl. So what you need to do, Tinkerbell, is just tell us where the Lost Boys are hiding. We'll kidnap Wendy, we'll take out your hair, and then you can just be free with Peter Pan, right, to do whatever it is that a pixie is meant to do with a 14-year-old boy or whatever. But anyway, Tinkerbell ends up snitching, and she gets what she deserves, which is that she ends up being locked in a cage by Captain Hook. So Captain Hook and the pirates end up now descending on the Lost Boys camp, but the Lost Boys are still like celebrating like being Indians and stuff, right? And Wendy kind of calms them down and says, look, at some point we're going to need to go home and, you know, just think about our mother. And this is where she sings a song about motherhood to them all, and like they all like, you know, really start missing like their mum and want to go home. So the Lost Boys and the Darling children are all like, right, we really want to go back home. But Peter Pan says, right, if you guys want to go, but like you'll be sorry and you'll be back, right? So Peter stays behind while the Darlings and the Lost Boys are kidnapped by the pirates. And Captain Hook, true to his word, he said he wouldn't lay a finger or a hook on Peter Pan. So what he does instead is he lowers a gift down into the thing with it labelled saying that it's from Wendy, do not open this until 6 p.m. So now back at the pirate ship, this is where, you know, they have all like the Lost Boys and the Darlings hostage, and the pirates say, if you don't join our ranks, then you're going to have to walk the plank. But Wendy says, don't sign it because Peter Pan is going to come and rescue us. And this is where Captain Hook reveals that what is actually in the gift is a ticking time bomb, yeah, which is set to go off at 6 p.m. So Tinkerbell ends up running free, and she goes all the way back to the thing and tells Peter Pan just in the nick of time that it's a bomb, and she takes it away. Somehow this bomb doesn't end up killing her or Peter Pan or destroying half the island, because the shockwaves from this is kind of, it would imply that everyone within the blast radius would be completely dead. But anyway, for some reason, they end up surviving this. So Peter Pan ends up rescuing Tinkerbell from the rubble, and this is where they go back. So as Wendy is being forced to walk the plank, she drops off, Peter Pan rescues her, and there ends up being a big fight between the Lost Boys and all the pirates. So eventually, Peter Pan ends up defeating Captain Hook. Captain Hook ends up running off into the horizon, being chased by the crocodile, and the boys commandeer the ship and turn it into their own ship. And they sail back across the skies, and they drop the Darling children off back to their home. So George and Mary Darling have come back from the party now, and they come back just in time for Wendy and the boys. And this is where, off in the distance, they see the ship, and this is when George Darling, seeing the ship, looks at it and remembers when he saw it last as a small boy. And so that's how the story ends. So that explains the plot of Peter Pan, and now we're going to dive into the story of the creative process that went into the making of it. So J.M. Barrie, he was a Scotsman, like we said, and the reason why he created the story of Peter Pan was, well, manifold, right? So first of all, it was a thing where, as a family friend, he ended up adopting 2 boys, and this is because, one of his friends ended up dying. So he adopted the 2 boys. One of the boys was called Peter, and so that's where the name Peter comes from. And Pan is the name of the Greek god of the woodlands, and he's basically a mischievous character. So with Peter Pan, he's basically a hero, but he's also a kind of like mischievous hero at that. So the character of Peter Pan was very much based off of Barry's older brother, right? So Barry's older brother at age 14 ended up dying in a skating accident, and so as his mother said, he was a boy that never grew up, and this is where the idea for that title comes from, right? So in 1913, this is where Walt Disney ended up coming across the story, right? Because he, at just 12 years old, he saw a touring production of it at his school. And then later on, he would play the role of Peter Pan in a school production. And actually, there's a very funny story about how, as he was flying about, the strings end up breaking, and he end up flying headfirst into the crowd, right? So as you can see, kind of like Peter Pan had a very big influence on him growing up, and so that's kind of why he wanted to make the film. And then in 1924, there ended up being a silent film of Peter Pan, and again, this really influenced him. So as early as 1935, he had decided that, at the moment they were working on Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, which came out in 1937, but he decided that this was going to be the second film that came out. However, then we're getting bogged down in all kinds of legal matters. Yeah, so from 1935 to 1939 ended up being all manner of different legal matters, and that's because the copyright for the story was given by Barrie to Great Ormond Street Hospital, right? So this is a children's hospital in London, and actually that's why in the opening credits you can see a shout out to St Ormond Street Hospital. So all this kind of went on for 4 years, and eventually in 1939 they got the rights to it. However, from 1939 to 1941, there end up being different debates with regard to the script. So first off, you had the debate as to whether to include Peter Pan's backstory or not. So obviously within the film version, they didn't end up including this because they thought it would just take too long and it wasn't necessary. And then on top of that, you also had a debate as to whether the Wendys would go to the Neverland by choice, or whether Peter Pan would actually kidnap them. So this ended up being quite a kind of like dark plot, and so things kind of got held up. And then in 1941, obviously World War II starts for America. And this is where the military end up taking over the studios, yeah. So that meant that they weren't able to kind of work on any new materials yet, like during this time, which weren't war related. So the film ended up being shelved for a little bit of time. And then after the war, Disney asked Jack Kenny to make some sequences for the thing. And he asked him to do a 2.5 hour presentation. And at the end of the 2.5 hour presentation, Disney said, I think we'll go with Cinderella. So you can imagine how kind of annoying that would be. So as we said with our last 2 videos of Cinderella and Alice in Wonderland, in 1948 there ended up being a race in the studios between these 3 different films for the 3 different sets of animators. So Cinderella ended up winning out in the end, because the animators got there before the others, but also it was felt that the characters in Alice in Wonderland and in Peter Pan at that point were too cold. And so their kind of characters needed more development at this point. And so that's why it ended up being shelved for a bit. And also as well, there was further debates with regard to what would be in the storyline. So for instance, there was a debate about should John be left behind because he's a bit too kind of like stiff and a bit too serious. And there was debates about whether Tinkerbell would be an intentional snitch or whether she'd be a kind of unintentional snitch, because in the actual original she herself is the one who goes after Captain Hook to tell the location. There's also debates about whether Nana the dog would come along, because in the film itself you can see that like she's tied up and is not able to fly off with them, but there's debates as to whether she'd come to Neverland with them. And on top of that as well, there was also debates as to the whole thing with the bomb. Yeah, right. Like we said, highly unrealistic, like about the bomb. I don't know why they decided to have this, because in the original there's poison and Tinkerbell ends up drinking that instead of Peter Pan, and I think that personally would have been a lot more realistic. I don't fully get why they went with the bomb, which is just kind of, like we said, it's just unrealistic, right? So anyway, that kind of explains why it was held back for a bit. So that explains a lot of the kind of like creative process that went into the making of it, right? But now we're going to be talking about the story of the studio. So production for the film officially started in 1949. And actually it's a thing where I didn't know this yet. So when I was doing research for some of the other videos, I didn't realize just the extent of what Disney would do in a lot of these like older videos, which is that they would film a whole kind of like live action film and then they would get the animators to animate it and stuff. For instance, with this, that's essentially what they did. So they had all the kind of actors like acting it out, and then the animators would animate. However, there were things that got held up within this process because it was a question of like how much the animators should make the characters look like the actors who are meant to be playing them. So for instance, there was the whole debate with regard to Peter Pan, with regard to Captain Hook, and with regard to Smee. So with Smee, for instance, there was decided that he would end up looking a lot like a Doc from Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. So with regard to looking like a dwarf. So a lot of his physiognomy is kind of like based on Doc's characteristics. Then with regard to Peter Pan, there was obviously the debate of, so you had Bobby Driscoll, who was playing a Peter Pan, and there was a debate of, how much should he look like that? And it was a thing where what was criticising them for was basically saying that, he looked far too much like Bobby. And actually what they wanted was for Peter Pan to look a lot like younger than Bobby, because Bobby Driscoll by this age was 16 years old. So they didn't want him to look like that. And then on top of that as well, you had the big debate with regard to Captain Hook. Now, I personally think that they made the right decision with this, because there was a debate about should he be more evil or should he be more of a kind of like con man, right? So the reason why I think that like Captain Hook is my favorite Disney villain is because he's kind of the most realistic. A lot of the others are either just idiots or it's a thing where they are just pure evil, right? Whereas for him, he's very manipulative. He's very kind of, you see a lot of, he's a very realistic character and stuff, and he's at times kind of likable, but it's also, you're very aware that he is a con man and he can't really be trusted. But still, it's a thing of, I think that he's the kind of most well-rounded like Disney villain, certainly in these kind of like older pictures. So so I think they made the right choice with regard to that. So talking about all of that, and now we're going to be talking about the casting, right? And the first thing I want to say with regard to casting is, I don't know why they made George American, right? He's a British boy growing up in a British household, right? Why I can get, Peter Pan and the rest of the Lost Boys, fine, they can be American because they, we don't know where they came from. But for him, in a household full of like, upper class English people, why would he have an American accent? So they got the wrong casting for that, and I don't understand why they couldn't have just got any English boy to have done the voice for that. But anyway, so you have him being played by a kind of unknown American actor. But like we said in previous videos, you had Bobby Driscoll, and you also had Catherine Beaumont. So Bobby Driscoll's in Song of the South. Catherine Beaumont is in Alice in Wonderland, like we said in the last video. You had Heather Angel, and she is the voice of Mary Darling. But in Alice in Wonderland, she is the voice of Alice's older sister. For Captain Hook, you had Hans Conried, and his physiognomy is used in Sleeping Beauty. So he didn't have the voice of the king in that, but it's a thing where the character is kind of based off what he looked like. You also had Bill Thompson, who is Smee. So like we said in the last video, he is also the voice of the White Rabbit in Alice in Wonderland. And then you had Candy Candia, and this is the voice of the Chief. So he plays many different minor kind of like character voices in a lot of like different films. So you have Sleeping Beauty, Jungle Book, Wizard of Oz, Fox and the Hound, Robin Hood, and yeah, so he's in quite a lot of other things like that as well, but he's a very kind of minor character. So that is the casting for a Peter Pan. So as you can see, compared to Alice in Wonderland, it's nowhere near as impressive, but that seems to not really matter so much, as we can see with all the other videos. We spoke about with Disney things. The casting does play a role, but not as much as you would think. It's actually better in many ways to get unknown people, so then you don't end up getting like caught up with, oh, this person's the voice of this and this person's the voice of that, etc. But anyway, so we spoke about the casting, we spoke about a lot of other things. But in terms of the rest of the story of the studio, this film here is kind of the end of an era in many regards with different Disney things. So, for instance, this the last film which Disney used RKO Pictures for. So all the other films which were done before this is RKO Pictures, but from then on, yeah, it was a thing where Disney had his own company, his own distribution company and stuff, right? So this is the last one, which is RKO. And on top of that as well, this is the last film in which you have all of Disney's so-called 9 old men. So this is all the really great animators like who are in this, like their names are on screen now. So these 9 old men, these are the main animators in nearly all the films which were done beforehand. So yeah, it's kind of the end of the era. And then also as well, this the last Disney film that had any Frank Churchill's music in it. So Frank Churchill, he did the music for Snow White, he did the music for Dumbo, he did it for Bambi, and of course he did it for this as well. And actually the theme of the crocodile in this, which is Never Smile at a Crocodile, he was the one who composed that, right? So just a little bit of trivia with that. So he died in 1942, committed suicide in 1942, unfortunately. But yeah, so this is the last film that he'd kind of like worked on the music for and stuff, yeah, so all the way back then. And yeah, so that basically explains the story of the studio. So now we can dive into the themes and the history of Peter Pan. So obviously, first of all, with regard to the themes and history, it's very much a stereotypical kind of 1950s film. So what I mean by that is, first of all, as you can see with regard to how the women are portrayed in it, it's a thing where they even say at one point, Wendy, and other girls in general talk too much, and is so she's very much as like a lot of like 1950s housewives, where they just kind of like, in the how they're depicted in films anyway, they kind of just rattle on about just nonsense, like far too much. And then also as well, you have the thing with the whole like jealousy and stuff, right? So even Tinkerbell, like as like Captain Hook says,
a jealous female can be tricked into anything.
And then again, the mermaid trying to drown Wendy. Again, it's really weird because why are all these people thirsty for like this one boy and stuff? But anyway, so you have that kind of underlying sexism within the film. Also as well, obviously the story being done by a British person at the turn of the last century is very stereotypical kind of, for instance, John's character, right? Very, very stereotypical kind of like British person, right? Stiff upper lip, a natural born leader. He lands in amongst like the Lost Boys and almost immediately ends up leading them and stuff, right? On a hunt for Indians. And also another thing, like in terms of the themes in the history, we said it before with regard to Disney films in terms of being outdated even for the times, right? And I think this is one of the most glaring examples because how the Indians are depicted in this, yes, I don't care what the original story might have had them depicted as and stuff, that was the turn of the last century. By the 1950s, this is outdated racism even for its time, in terms of how things were portrayed in films. So if you look at how, how Indians are portrayed in 1950s westerns, right? And I'll say Indians because it's American Indians, right? They themselves prefer it. It's kind of like when people say Latinx. It's a thing where the community themselves do not refer to themselves in that way. So American Indians do not refer to themselves for the most part as Native Americans. That's just something which is a exonym, right? It's kind of imposed on them. But anyway, so the Indians in that, and I'll keep saying Indians, right? It's a thing where how they're portrayed is so unlike how Indians were portrayed in Westerns at the time. And John Wayne even made the point of this, that he had never allowed himself to be in a picture which had Indians portrayed in such a kind of derogatory way. So the only one where it even comes close to that is if you look at Red River from 1948, where you have one character who's a kind of cranky old man, and he kind of like talks about savages, etc., right? But that's kind of the only film. So by the 1950s, how Indians were portrayed is with their humanity. So you would never see in a Western something like what makes the red man red. You never hear like the constant reference to them as savages and etc. It was dated even for its time, right? And the references to savages are just so numerous. It's shocking that it was ever allowed, and it's also just so unnecessary within the whole flow of it. Like the fact that people sat down and actually wrote up the song "What Makes the Red Man Red" is just, I think, even for the time, that kind of mentality at least belongs in the 1930s and 1940s, yeah, and certainly by 1950, it's just not acceptable, and it wouldn't have been acceptable at the time. I don't understand why it was allowed to pass. But anyway, in spite of all that, the legacy of Peter Pan was really, really positive. So it had a budget of $4 million, and it made 87 million at the box office. And this is just in the US and Canada. So it's absolutely like fantastic film, like kind of like in terms of box office, it really, really well. In terms of its lifetime grossing figure, it had $427 million, yeah, and this is adjusted for inflation over the course of its life. Now, it didn't win any awards like a lot of like older like Disney films did, but it still has many memorable things in it. So for instance, like the song like "You Can Fly," really, really memorable. Following the leader song, again, that's really catchy, even if it's kind of problematic at certain points. But it's a really good film. It's really entertaining. Throughout the whole thing, like it's got good pacing, lots of kind of like funny bits within it. At no point in it do you kind of watch it and kind of go, this is a bit boring. So yeah, really highly recommend it. And now kind of talking about the notable lines and notable effects. And actually with this one, the script writing is really, really good, yeah. Like so there's lots of like really good lines such as this.
She's a wonderful nurse, although Father says...
Girls talk too much.
Yes, girls talk too... Oh.
Well, get on with it, girl.
And such as this.
Algonquin. Quite savage, you know.
Let's go get him.
Come on, we'll get him.
And such as this.
Now remember, the Indian is cunning, but not intelligent. Therefore, we simply surround them and take them by surprise.
And such as this.
The poor captain has a splitting headache. We mustn't annoy him.
And such as this.
We were only trying to drown her.
You see?
Well, if you think for 1 minute that I'm going to put up with...
And in terms of notable effects, I have to say that the film is not as great as, say, for instance, Cinderella. And visually speaking, it's, at least Alice in Wonderland had kind of like great moments. There's a few moments on it on the screen now like you can kind of see, but it's not that great of a film. Like, it's good, but like visually speaking, it's not like that fantastic. Yeah, there's no kind of like crazy shots that they have like in the same way that they do in Cinderella, where it looks like a like live action film. It's very basic. Yeah? It's just a nice fun cartoon, and it's something that the whole family can enjoy, providing that you kind of ignore or fast forward through the kind of like overtly racist bits with the Indians, right? But that's my take on it, and I hope that you well, even if you don't share my opinion on it, leave it in the comment section of what your opinion on Peter Pan is. So, like we said, like the video, subscribe if you haven't already, hit the bell button so you stay notified, and next week we are going to be covering Lady and the Tramp from 1955. So, in the meantime, have a great day, and bye.